So let's begin by reading from the last part of chapter 5. It's chapter 5, verse 11 through verse 14. And we'll almost certainly cover all 3 verses tonight.
Almost.
We never can be completely sure. And 3 verses is a lot for one evening. So verse 11. About this we have much to say, which is hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. That's funny.
Mine says sluggish.
Yeah, the sluggish is good too. Sluggish of hearing. Although by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of God's word. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their faculties trained by practice to distinguish good from evil. So that's quite a heavy exhortation, if you can even describe it as an exhortation, which is generally how it's described. It seems rather more of a negative exhortation than a positive. But how does this fit in? Is this just simply an interruption and a digression?
It seems to me like he's saying that we don't know as much as we think we do, which is true. And we have to start with the very basics again.
Once we continue on, we'll find that this exhortation really continues in chapter 6. And then he picks up the theme of the priesthood of Melchizedek once again in chapter 7. So one of the arguments is that this is a homily that was presented orally and was then written down. And so, the author is originally speaking rather than writing. And so he notices that, people are snoring and, falling asleep or have these blank expressions on their faces. But is there anything that suggests that it's not an interruption or a digression?
Actually, the first sentence. We have much to say about this, meaning Christ's death and his obedience at that time, which is hard to explain. And yes, that section was hard to explain. So I think he's referring back to the section just before.
Right. Yeah, the hard to explain, the language in Greek suggests that what is hard to explain is the topic.
Is the what?
That what is hard to explain is the topic itself. That the difficulty of explanation is a function neither of the speaker or of the audience. So that part of the sentence, about this we have much to say, which is hard to explain. So the which is hard to explain is the inherent difficulty of the topic. So, but then he adds, since you have become dull of hearing, or sluggish of hearing, depending on your translation, which also means that the audience is not listening. So
Is it that they're not listening or they're not understanding?
they're not understanding.
Mhm.
I mean, you know, they're,
It's beyond, way beyond.
I mean, it's kind of like they're kind of listening like men listen. You know?
They are men.
Right,
There's the problem.
they are men, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So on the one hand, this can be viewed as an interruption, but on the other hand, it can also be viewed as a continuity, as continuous, both with previous exhortations and with the text of the letter as a whole. So let's begin by looking at the previous exhortations. The first one is in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Therefore, we must pay the closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For if the message declared by angels was valid, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? So there's a danger of drifting away. Remember, in the metaphor is of a ship that at harbor that is just being drifted away by the tides. So there's a danger of drifting away. Then in the next exhortation is in chapter 3, verses 7 to 19. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness. So notice, hear his voice, hearing, testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore, I was provoked with that generation. Instead, they always go astray in their hearts. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall never enter my rest. Take care, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we share in Christ if only we hold our first confidence firm to the end. Well, it is said, today when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. So he's moved from a sort of warning to not drift away, not let the tide sort of carry you away, not get, sort of taken away almost inadvertently, to listen and do not harden your hearts. Do not be like the wilderness generation. And here he intensifies it and includes the thing of sluggishness, of being dull of hearing. So there's an intensification of the previous exhortations. And the last one, do not be like the wilderness generation, is itself a fairly stern warning. All of the members of the wilderness generation did not reach the promised land. He's introduced the theme of Jesus as high priest much earlier, but he's just, in the beginning of chapter 5, introduced it more intensively and more thoroughly. So it would, what does that suggest about, sort of a continuity with this exhortation being a continuity with the previous section and not an interruption?
So would you say that again, what you're asking? My hearing was dull right then.
Sluggish. So what I'm asking is that, is there a relationship between the immediate previous section of chapter 5, verse 1 through verse 10, where he really intensively introduces the theme of Jesus as high priest, and this section? Might that also account for the intensification of his exhortation, or for its almost insulting tone in calling someone listener sluggish and hard of hearing? Is, I mean, you know, if Father Booth did it during his homily, there would probably not be very many people who would be deeply appreciative.
Well, Christ understands the human condition because he was human for a while, even though he was better at it than we are. But he understands our failures. And so even though we become dull of hearing, there's a continual try to get us to live our lives the way we should, to understand what is going on in his passages. And the writer of this is just trying so hard to get us to understand it, saying that even though we're dull of hearing, we might not get it, Christ understands that, but the whole thing is to keep trying.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I've been in class for so many years.
So he's just shown how Christ is continuous with the priesthood, right? And different from the priesthood. So Christ is a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, and Melchizedek precedes the Aaronic priesthood or the Levitical priesthood. So that's obviously an attack is probably the wrong word. The implication, therefore, would be that the Levitical priesthood is obsolete. It's been replaced. And so given that the audience consists of Jewish Christians, and he's concerned about where they're going, the place that they would be going would be back to the temple system and sacrifice in the temple. And so that means that this last section, where he increasingly focuses on the theme of Christ as high priest, I mean, it's really fine to say Jesus is higher than the angels, Jesus is greater than Moses, you know, that's all well and good. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, he's attacking here the temple system and the temple system of temple worship. He's saying it's obsolete. It's been replaced by Christ himself, who is the high priest. So in that case, there's no place to go back to. And yet clearly some of his audience is thinking of going back to it. So if you're thinking of going back to it, you're going to have difficulty hearing what he's just said, or what he's just written, which has been read.
And they still haven't accepted him as the Messiah.
Well, they have, but so if we look at his language here, he says you have become dull of hearing.
Hmm.
So the implication is that they weren't dull. It's not that they are dull of hearing. It's a perfect tense. They have become dull of hearing. So the implication then is that they once weren't dull of hearing, and they once were capable of hearing this. So notice he says, for by this time you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you again the first principles of God's word. The again suggests that they didn't need someone to teach them the first principles. He's saying that they've backslidden. And in fact, that's exactly the word that Chrysostom uses to describe what he's saying, that they backslid.
You said that they backslid. Is that sliding back in understanding, or is it sliding back in living up to and performing daily living, daily life in a Christian sense?
It's probably both.
Mhm.
And there's a certain, unity of theory and practice.
If you're sluggish,
So, thinking about it, the relationship between the old and the new covenant, and between Jesus' teaching and the Mosaic law. What's important under the law? What's important is that you follow the purity laws. You sacrifice properly animals, stuff, the occasional turtle dove. The dietary laws are important. So under the new covenant, Jesus had no regard for the dietary laws. They don't accomplish anything. They just don't do anything. It's not what goes in, it's what comes out that defiles a man. So dietary laws go out the window. Jesus announced that he was the temple. So the sacrificial laws go out the window. And we're called to be a living sacrifice. So that's certainly not the case in Judaism. So there's a profound difference. And so if as a Jewish Christian, if as a Jew you've embraced Christ and you matured to a certain degree in the faith, probably a great degree in the faith, and are then thinking of going backwards, thinking of returning to following the Mosaic law, thinking of returning to the sacrificial system, then that's a huge change, that requires a huge change both in thought and behavior. So in order to do that, you have to backslide. You have to return to a previous belief system, or else you can't do it. Unless you're sort of purely transactional, which most people aren't. So the hearing thing and the hard of hearing and the sluggish of hearing and the insultingness, I think is intended to call to mind chapter 6 of Isaiah, verses 9 through 13. So let's take a look at them. Let's start at verse 6, just to provide a little bit of context. Then flew one of the seraphim to me, having in his hand a burning coal which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin forgiven. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here am I, send me. And he said, go and say to this people, hear and hear, but do not understand. See and see, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people fat and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. And he said, until cities lie waste without inhabitants, and houses without men, and the land is utterly desolate, and the Lord removes men far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains standing when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. The prophet is sent to preach a warning. The hope is that the warning will be heard. And so the hope is actually the fact that everyone will hear and hear and understand, will see and see, but will perceive. That the heart of this people will not be fat, their ears not heavy, their eyes not shut, so that they can see, they can hear, they can understand, they can turn and be healed. But there's also the warning and the recognition that that will probably may not happen, and that perhaps only a remnant will in fact listen. So here it's the tenth. That kind of in a nutshell is sort of the prophetic language of the carrot and the stick.
Mhm.
On the one hand, you hope for to be heard, and on the other hand, expect not. So in talking about hearing, the author may be hoping to draw on a mental image of that passage among his hearers. So what he's trying to do then is probably to shock them and to bring them to a place of re-evaluating their position and of re-evaluating the direction that they're going. One of the things that has puzzled interpreters really from the time that the letter was written is the phrase, the word of righteousness. So there have been tons of interpretations of what that means or might mean. Does anyone have any want to venture a guess?
Well, understanding what is right. Right? I mean, the word, I guess, would be things that have been told to them in living the right way.
Mm-hmm.
Because children don't understand what is expected or what is living right. And it's only when we become more mature that we understand what is the right way to live.
Mm-hmm. And so you've hit on two of the interpretations, and probably two of the most common ones. First sees word and righteousness as separate. So the word is the Christian message, what you described as what has been told. And the righteous, the living the right way, righteousness, the righteousness of God, which is made known and available through Christ. Actually, you've hit on three of them. Word of righteousness, the right conduct that God expects us to follow. That's actually Healy's interpretation. Word of righteousness is a continuation of needing milk in the child metaphor. Children are incapable of understanding correct normal speech. So it's what is told to them. Anything else? Chrysostom sees word of righteousness as referring to Jesus saying in the Sermon on the Mount in verse 20, chapter 5, verse 20 of Matthew, except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. So he thinks word of righteousness refers to that.
I got two different thoughts going in my head. It's one thing to know something or learn something. It's another thing to live it.
Uh-huh.
You know, Healy talks about how many Catholics seem satisfied with an 8th grade level or lower level of understanding of their faith. So, you know, you
Right.
go to catechism, you go to a Catholic school and have a religion, hopefully every
Uh-huh.
day, like I did with my kids. But so you're just learning. But to mature in your faith, you need to continuously learn.
Uh-huh.
And it's also quoted in Healy's book about John Paul II. I mean, Vatican II, you know, hadn't happened that much earlier, talking about, yeah, we need to have more, you know, we need to grow in our faith.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's kind of set aside in our secular culture, but that's the responsibility of each of us
Mm-hmm.
to do that. You know, you're fed it as a child like the milk, but then we know the food's there. We need to get it ourselves.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and it remains milk until then.
Exactly.
Yeah, although in this case, the problem is that these are people who were once more mature and are now less.
Right.
Although, you know, we can, I mean, we probably should spend some time discussing the kind of contemporary relevance of his warning to ourselves.
Right. Well, they were taught to be teachers. They weren't just
Well,
to learn it for themselves.
It's
in
not
Hebrew.
necessarily that he's saying that they were taught to be teachers in the sense of someone who's actively teaching. I think what he's saying is that they should be teachers and that they should be models or examples of what a Christian is. And they're not doing that.
Leading by example.
Leading by example. The phrase, the word of righteousness, is very unusual. for starters, word, the word for word is logos, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. So logos can mean Christ himself, as in John's gospel. But that's written much later. And although the author of Hebrews has a very high Christology, we can't necessarily assume that he would equate logos with Christ. So logos is probably not Christ. It can also mean an actual word. It can mean a message, or it can mean the process of reasoning about something. And then righteousness, it's the same word that Paul uses to describe justification, but the author isn't really concerned with justification, so it doesn't mean that. So righteousness then, becomes a word that is, sort of capable of multiple interpretations. So God is inherently righteous. So in some form that may mean following God's laws, refer to a certain style of living. And there's also a question of whether word of righteousness, whether that's a single phrase that means something, that has a meaning independent of word and righteousness. So one of the places where we find the phrase used is in Polycarp, in his letter to the Philippians. It's in paragraph 9 of this letter to the Philippians, and I'll read it. I appeal now to every one of you to hear and obey the call of holiness. The call of holiness here is word of righteousness. And to exercise the same perfect fortitude that you have seen with your own eyes in the blessed Ignatius and Zosimus and Rufus, and not in them alone, but in a number of your own townsmen as well, to say nothing of Paul himself and the other apostles. Be very sure that the course of these men was not run in vain, but faithfully and honorably, and that they have now reached a well-earned place at the side of the Lord, whose pains they shared. Their hearts were not set on this world of ours, but on him who died for our sakes and was raised up again for us by God. So hear and obey the call of the word of righteousness, and exercise the same perfect fortitude that you have seen. Does anyone realize what the fortitude is? And that you've seen in the blessed Ignatius and Zosimus and Rufus? Do you know who Ignatius is?
Which Ignatius?
That's the question.
Loyola?
Father of the church.
Yeah, Ignatius of Loyola is over a millennia later.
Mhm.
Polycarp is a first generation father immediately after the apostles. He was the bishop of Smyrna.
And Ignatius was his student or something?
No, Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch. So remember Ignatius, not Ignatius. Yes, Ignatius. I'm getting myself tongue-tied with Polycarps and Ignatiuses. So Ignatius was arrested in Antioch and sentenced to death, and was to be executed, or was to be consumed by the animals in the Colosseum in Rome. So as he was going from Antioch to Rome, he wrote letters to 7 churches. The last one, the church in Rome, in advance of his arrival, asking them not to prevent his death, and to make sure that all remnants of himself were consumed by the animals, that there be no relics left. The remaining 6, actually of the remaining 6 letters, 5 were to churches after he passed through them. And the 6th one was to Bishop Polycarp. And so in any case, Polycarp knew Ignatius and knew of his martyrdom. And so what he's talking here, the word of righteousness, it's unusual that there would be the same phrase, even though the word of righteousness is probably sort of a code word for martyrdom and courage to persist in the face of martyrdom.
Oh,
So what he's talking about, if that's true, and we have, given that the combination of phrases is unusual and it's unclear, what he means. But if that's true, then he's talking about people who are under pressure to return to Judaism, under threat of violence, under threat of possible martyrdom. And he's exhorting them to persist, to not back down, to not abandon the principles of the faith, because there is no going back. And going back, in essence, is a renunciation of Christ, and therefore is an embracing of evil. So in that case, it becomes sort of a heavy-duty message, to hold oneself in readiness for martyrdom, really implying that the fear of recoiling from the fear of violent death points to a failure in moral character.
It's a lot to live up to.
Yeah, Polycarp himself, incidentally, was also martyred. The attempt to, as I recall, the attempt to burn him failed, so they stabbed him.
it was
But
St.
he
Lawrence who said, "I'm done on one side. Could you turn me over now?"
Yeah,
So does that mean, if you, like you said, Mary, it's a lot to live up to. Do we have to all go through that kind of stuff? I guess if we're teachers.
well, some people still are.
Well, if you think
Unfortunately.
about what happened in the early days of ISIS, they took people who were Christians and they were trying to get them to denounce Christianity, and they wouldn't, so they cut off their heads and killed them.
Same thing.
A few
Yeah.
years,
They did it not only to Christians, they did it to Muslims that they felt were, not
Muslim enough.
not Muslim enough, right? Right,
And so it's still going on.
right, it's still going on.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Certainly, George.
It's me again. Going back to verse 13, everyone who lives on milk lacks experience of the word of righteousness, for he is a child. And I'm sitting up here thinking, to even, how can I say it? that according to this, I guess I would be living on milk. I don't have the understanding that apparently the author had, or the depth. And but I don't really even know what the question is, but when does one, according to this concept, graduate to solid food? When does one know enough, or believe enough, or have the qualities enough in Christendom to move forward, to be mature in the faith?
I think it's always a process. So I don't know that any of us are ever really, mature in the faith. And the fundamental problem is that God is incomprehensible.
Mhm.
God is infinite. And so there's an infinite amount of knowledge to know about God, which exceeds our understanding and our capabilities. So in that sense, I think, the question really is to rest on the foundation. So I guess in some ways, going back to, the comment that pastor had made earlier, you haven't been a Christian for 10 years, you've been Christian for 1 year, 10 times. And so there's the apostolic tradition gives for us a certain foundation, sort of a set of essential principles on which the faith is based. And, from there, we should, and in it and from it, we should grow. So in this case, you've only been a Christian for 1 year, 10 times. The person who is speaking to was, sort of, as you could say, theologically all over the place. So almost each year, she sort of changed her theological focus. So 1 year she was into the King James only movement, which, is Catholics were probably not aware of the King James only movement, but it's people who believe, evangelicals who believe that the King James translation of the Bible is the only anointed English language version. And so they've spent hours comparing, probably thousands of hours comparing the King James version with the other Protestant versions, and have found supposedly all of the ways in which the divinity of Christ is denied, which are really the result of extractions from the King James Version due to the fact that the things being removed were scribal additions. And also to the peculiarity of the manuscripts with which the King James Version was assembled, or Textus Receptus, the Greek language version of the New Testament was assembled. Just for background about the King James Version, but the thing is that each year, for 1 year, she was into boundaries, which is sort of anti-Christian, and so every year it's a different thing.
Mhm.
So this is, a babe in Christ perpetually, because next year there's going to be some new big thing, and there you go. So the question, I think, is one, your foundation upon which you're building, but that building is a lifelong process. It is, for everybody. It is for the Pope. It is for each of us. It is for those of us who are teachers. It is for those of us who are simply learning. We're all learning. We're all on a journey. So the question is, are you growing? And, sort of, I think, unfortunately related to that is that many Catholics are not growing. Many Catholics, are still, don't know the faith very well. And so that's, that's very sad. But, we should all be learning. We should all be progressing. We should all be growing in the faith. I don't think that's really an option. I think that there are profound dangers to not grow in the faith, very much like the author is warning his listeners or his audience that there's no going back to anything, where there are no alternatives than to being a Christian. So, does that answer your question, George?
Let me dwell on it. I don't know kind of an answer I was looking for. I don't know. Every time I look at this sentence of paragraph of verse 13, I get another question.
Uh-huh.
And
well, that's good.
Yeah.
If
That's a really good question. Because
Yeah.
as I listened to your question, I was trying to think of, how would I answer that, or what do I think about that? And my first thought was, what a profound question.
thank you. You're very flattering. Thank you.
No, I mean it, because I was sitting here writing kind of, and I said, we may have started out with the knowledge of our faith as children, but it's incumbent upon us to continue to grow in the faith by studying, but not just that, by knowledge. But if you don't pair the knowledge with the changing in how you live it, then you're still static. Because if it's just knowledge, but you're not doing anything with it, then that's static too.
Mhm.
Yeah, right.
So it's a two-pronged way we have to live.
So
And
if
that's
you
the
look at
hard
it,
part. Living, it's the hard part.
so if you look at it in terms of, if word of righteousness is in fact the same phrase used by Polycarp, if this was a phrase that was current in the apostolic and immediate post-apostolic period, that was sort of a synonym for martyrdom or near martyrdom. Then if we look at the sentence that way, for everyone who lives on milk, so those who are immature, is unskilled in the word of righteousness. So what is unskilled in the word of righteousness? And that means that you don't have the strength to live out your faith. That means that at the first obstacle, or even not necessarily the first obstacle, at anything from the first obstacle to a very serious obstacle, you're going to back down. And the author's position is, almost certainly a hardcore one, but the faith, and this is a period of martyrdom. And, we can read it in Polycarp's letter, where he, holds up Saint Ignatius as an example.
Mhm.
And also, I mean, given that he mentioned Saint Ignatius, if you know, those of you who took the patristic fathers class, you remember the major theme of all but the letter to Polycarp of his 7 letters was the imitation of Christ. That in dying, he wanted to imitate Christ. In dying, he wanted to combine his sacrifice with that of Christ for the benefit of humanity. And he was thanking God that he was arrested, that his arrest stopped the arrests and the persecution in Antioch, and so that he would be the last of the Anti-Essenes to die. So, and so Polycarp, knew of those letters. In fact, I mean, one of them was to the Church of Smyrna, of which Polycarp was bishop. So with milk, you can't firmly reflect the faith. You'll back down at some obstacle. So we can interpret the sentence that way. But it is critical that we live out what we profess we believe. And also critical that we maintain our maturity.
Mhm.
I've been listening to some of the older videos from classes, and they're just a year old in some cases. And I've been sort of shocked that I've been discussing things that I've since forgotten.
I'm glad to hear you say that.
And so, I mean, it's also important to maintain what we learn. And that's in some ways, that's difficult given the richness of our faith. And in some ways, how comprehensive it is. So that's an important thing too, that we there's he's talking about sort of backsliding under pressure, and sort of making a choice because you don't want to lose anything, don't want to risk martyrdom, don't want to be persecuted, don't want tension. We can also sort of just backslide kind of casually and inadvertently, going back to this first metaphor of the ship that just kind of is carried out, with the unanchored ship kind of carried out to sea. If we're not careful, that can happen to us too. So his warning, in many ways, is one that we should take seriously, although we are not threatened with persecution or death. But there are real ways in which in our society we don't. There are incentives to not live out the gospel message, and in which unfortunately many Catholics don't know the faith very well. Far too many.
Again, it points out why it's important to keep going over many of the topics again and again, like you have done in your classes. To hear it again helps put it back in another place, because each time we're at a different place in our lives and something will click, that didn't, you thought, oh yeah, I got that, and then it didn't hold. But by continually coming back to certain themes or ideas,
Mhm,
each time it's a little building block and understanding.
right. Yeah. Yeah. If you get the chance, I would highly recommend reading St. Ignatius's 7 letters. They're really, really outstanding. As well as reading Polycarp. There's Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, which is available. There's the Martyrdom of Polycarp, which was written by one of his deacons. And then there's actually an account of the trial of Polycarp, which is official Roman document from the what is called, probably from the governor of the area that Smyrna was in. They're all well worth reading. And especially the 7 letters of Saint Ignatius of Antioch.